The church bells of Millfield, Texas, rang out across the dusty plains on what should have been the happiest day of 18-year-old Sarah Mae Thompson's life. Instead, they tolled like a death knell as she stood in her mother's wedding dress, staring at herself in the cracked mirror of the parsonage. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle to marry Ezekiel Hartwell, a man 42 years her senior who owned half the county and viewed her as just another acquisition for his vast holdings. But Sarah Mae had other plans. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race, but not with the terror that had plagued her for weeks. This was different. This was hope riding hard across the Texas prairie in the form of a young cowboy named Jake Morrison who had promised her something she'd never dared dream of: freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thompson family's modest farmhouse as Sarah Mae sat at her mother's dressing table, her hands trembling as she attempted to pin her auburn hair into the elaborate style her future mother-in-law had insisted upon. Each curl felt like another link in the chain that was binding her to a future she couldn't bear to imagine. "Hold still, child," her mother Martha Thompson said with forced cheerfulness as she adjusted the veil that had been in the family for 3 generations. "You're fidgeting like a cat in a thunderstorm." Sarah Mae met her mother's eyes in the mirror, seeing the conflict there that had been growing stronger each day since the engagement was announced 6 months ago. Martha Thompson was a woman caught between survival and conscience, and Sarah Mae knew the choice was tearing her apart. "Mama," Sarah Mae whispered, "are you certain this is the only way?" Martha's hands stilled on the delicate lace of the veil. For a moment the mask of maternal authority slipped, revealing the desperate woman beneath. "Sarah Mae, we've been over this 100 times. Your father's debts. If we don't pay them, we'll lose everything. The farm, the house, everything. Your grandfather built with his own hands. The farm, always it came back to the farm, 200 acres of stubborn Texas soil that had been in the Thompson family since before the war between the states. Land that had sustained them through droughts and floods, through the death of Sarah Mae's father just 2 years prior, and through the economic struggles that had plagued Texas in the aftermath of Reconstruction. But the land couldn't pay the debts that Samuel Thompson had accumulated in his final years, debts that had mounted as he'd grown increasingly desperate to save the farm from foreclosure. Gambling debts, mostly, owed to men who weren't known for their patience or mercy. When Samuel died suddenly of a heart attack, those debts had fallen to his widow and daughter like a crushing weight. Enter Ezekiel Hartwell, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, a cattle baron who'd built his empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and ruthless determination. Hartwell owned the bank that held the mortgage on the Thompson farm. He owned the general store where they bought their supplies. He owned vast stretches of grazing land, the largest house in Millfield, and now, through the marriage contract he'd negotiated with Martha Thompson, he would own Sarah Mae as well. "He's not a cruel man," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as she repeated the justification she'd been clinging to for months. "Ezekiel has been a widower for 5 years now. He needs a wife to manage his household, to give him children, to carry on his name. He's promised to treat you well, to give you every comfort." Sarah Mae turned in her chair to face her mother directly. "Every comfort except the right to choose my own husband, my own future, my own life." "Choice is a luxury we can't afford," Martha replied sharply, but her voice cracked on the last word. "Do you think I chose to marry your father when I was barely 17? Do you think any woman of our station gets to marry for love? We marry for survival, Sarah Mae. That's the way of the world." But Sarah Mae had seen a different way of the world, had glimpsed it in stolen moments over the past 3 months as she'd gotten to know Jake Morrison, the young cowboy who'd been hired to help with the cattle roundup on neighboring ranches. Jake, who was 24 years old with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a Texas sky after a summer storm. Jake, who looked at her as if she was something precious rather than something to be owned. Their first meeting had been entirely by chance. Sarah May had been riding her father's old horse, Belle, along the creek that formed the eastern boundary of their property when she'd come upon Jake watering his horse at the same spot. He tipped his hat to her with the easy courtesy of a man raised to respect women, but it was the way he'd smiled that had stopped her heart. "Afternoon, miss," he'd said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone raised in East Texas. "Beautiful day for a ride." "It is indeed," Sarah May had replied, acutely aware of how her voice sounded higher than usual. She'd been raised to be polite to strangers, but something about this young man made her want to linger, to find excuses to continue the conversation. "I'm Jake Morrison," he'd said, dismounting to let his horse drink more comfortably. "I'm working the cattle drive for the Brennan Ranch. Don't believe I've had the pleasure of making your acquaintance." "Sarah May Thompson," she'd replied, surprised by her own boldness in giving her full name to a stranger. "My family owns the farm just over that ridge." That first conversation had lasted only a few minutes, but it had planted a seed of possibility in Sarah May's mind, a glimpse of what it might be like to talk to a man who treated her as an equal rather than a possession. Over the following weeks, their chance encounters at the creek had become less chance and more intentional. Jake would time his rides to coincide with hers, and Sarah May would find reasons to visit the creek more frequently. Their conversations had ranged from the practical discussions of weather and cattle and the challenges of farming in Texas to the personal. Jake had told her about his childhood in Jefferson, about the father he'd lost in the war and the mother who died of fever when he was 16. He'd spoken of his dreams of someday owning his own ranch, of building something lasting with his own hands, and Sarah May had found herself sharing things she'd never told another soul. Her love of reading, despite having only a handful of books to choose from, her secret ambition to see the world beyond Texas, to visit the great cities she'd read about in her father's old newspapers, her fear that she would live and die within 50 miles of where she'd been born, never knowing what lay beyond the horizon. "You could see those cities," Jake had said during one of their conversations. "Nothing's stopping you except the belief that you have to stay where you were born." "Easy. Enough to say," Sarah May had replied, though her heart had leaped at the suggestion. "I'm a woman with no money and no family beyond my mother. Where would I go? How would I survive?" "There are ways," Jake had said, his eyes intense as he looked at her. "There are places in this country where a woman can make her own way, where being smart and brave matters more than who your family is or how much money you have. California, Oregon Territory, even some of the bigger cities back east. The world's changing, Sarah May. There are opportunities now that didn't exist when our parents were young." Those conversations had sustained Sarah May through the darkest moments of the past 3 months, had given her something to hold on to when the weight of her approaching marriage to Ezekiel Hartwell threatened to crush her spirit entirely. But they had also made her situation more unbearable, because now she knew what she was giving up. The sound of wheels on gravel interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah May looked out the window to see Ezekiel Hartwell's carriage approaching the house. Her future husband had come to escort her family to the church, as was proper. In a few moments she would have to face the man who would own her by evening. Ezekiel Hartwell was not an ugly man, Sarah May had to admit. He was tall and well-dressed, with silver threading through his dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his wishes obeyed, and he had been unfailingly polite in his interactions with Sarah May during their brief courtship. But politeness was not kindness, and respect was not love. Sarah May had seen the way Ezekiel looked at her, the way he discussed their future marriage as if she were a business arrangement rather than a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. He had made it clear that he expected her to be an ornament to his household, a young wife who would bear his children and manage his domestic affairs while never challenging his authority or expressing opinions that differed from his own. "He's here," Martha said unnecessarily, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Sarah May, promise me you'll try to be happy. Promise me you'll make the best of this situation." Sarah May stood and smoothed the skirts of her wedding dress, feeling the weight of the silk and lace that had cost more than her family typically spent on clothing in a year. Ezekiel had insisted on paying for the dress, along with everything else related to the wedding, another reminder that she was being purchased rather than courted. "I promise I'll try, Mama," Sarah May said, and she meant it. If this marriage was truly inevitable, she would do her best to find whatever happiness was possible within its constraints. But even as she made the promise, her mind was on Jake Morrison and the conversation they'd had just 2 days earlier. She'd found him, waiting by the creek as usual, but this time his expression had been serious, almost grim. "Sarah May," he'd said without preamble, "I can't stand by and watch you throw your life away." "It's not your choice to make," she'd replied, though her heart had hammered against her ribs at the intensity in his voice. "No, but it is yours," Jake had said, stepping closer to her. "You still have a choice, even if you don't think you do." "What choice?" Sarah May had asked, though part of her already knew what he was going to say. "Come with me," Jake had said simply. "I'm leaving Texas after the cattle drive ends. I've saved enough money to get us to California, maybe Oregon. We could start fresh somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows us or cares about your family's debts." The proposal had been so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of possibility Sarah May had been considering, that for a moment she'd been unable to speak. "Jake," she'd finally managed, "you're talking about running away together, about scandal and ruin and—" "I'm talking about freedom," Jake had interrupted. "I'm talking about choosing your own life instead of having it chosen for you. I'm talking about the possibility of real happiness instead of resigned acceptance." "But my mother, the farm, the debts—" "Your mother will survive this," Jake had said gently. "She's stronger than you think, and there are other ways to deal with debts than selling your daughter. As for the farm—" He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah May is keeping that land worth sacrificing your entire life." The question had haunted Sarah May for 2 days now, and she still didn't have a clear answer. The farm represented everything her family had built, everything her father had worked for, everything that connected her to her heritage and her past. But it also represented the trap that was forcing her into a marriage she didn't want. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thompson? Miss Thompson?" Ezekiel Hartwell's voice was courteous but commanding. "The carriage is ready." "We'll be right there," Martha called back, then turned to her daughter. "Sarah May, whatever doubts you're having, it's too late now. The contracts are signed, the guests are waiting, the minister is ready. There's no turning back." But as Sarah May looked at herself one last time in the mirror, she realized that her mother was wrong. There was still time to turn back, still time to choose a different path. The question was whether she had the courage to take it. Outside, she could hear Ezekiel Hartwell talking to one of the neighbors who had arrived early for the wedding. His voice was pleasant, jovial even, as he discussed the weather and the prospects for the cattle market. He sounded like a man who was pleased with his acquisition, satisfied with the bargain he had struck. In a few hours, Sarah May would be Mrs. Ezekiel Hartwell, mistress of the largest house in the county, wife to one of the most powerful men in Texas. She would have security, comfort, and social position. She would also have a husband old enough to be her father, a man who saw her as property rather than partner, and a future that stretched before her like a prison sentence. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance caught her attention, and Sarah May moved to the window. A lone rider was approaching fast from the direction of the creek, too far away to identify, but riding with the kind of urgency that suggested important news. Her heart began to race as she recognized the possibility that the rider might be Jake Morrison, that he might be coming to make good on his promise to offer her an alternative to the marriage that waited for her at the church. "Sarah May." Martha's voice seemed to come from very far away. "It's time to go." Sarah May took a deep breath and turned away from the window. Whatever was coming, whatever choice she was about to make, there was no more time for hesitation. The moment of decision had arrived, and she would have to choose between the security of accepting her fate and the terrifying possibility of choosing her own future. The rider was getting closer, and Sarah May could see now that it was indeed Jake Morrison, riding hard toward the Thompson farmhouse with something that looked remarkably like desperation in his posture. He was coming for her just as he had promised he would. The question was, would she have the courage to go with him? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To Bus. Now back to the story. The dust cloud trailing behind Jake Morrison's horse grew larger as he approached the Thompson farmhouse, and Sarah May felt her entire world balance on the edge of a knife. Through the thin walls of the modest home, she could hear Ezekiel Hartwell's voice, growing slightly impatient as he discussed departure times with her mother, unaware that his carefully laid plans were about to be challenged by a cowboy with nothing to lose and everything to prove. "Sarah May, we really must go," Martha called from the front room, her voice carrying the strain of a woman trying to maintain composure while her life crumbled around her. "Mr. Hartwell has been more than patient, but the guests will be expecting us at the church." Sarah May pressed her palms against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching as Jake reined in his horse just beyond the front gate. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he sat his horse like a man preparing for battle. He had come for her, just as he'd promised, but the final choice remained hers alone. The weight of that choice pressed down on her like a physical force. Everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved, every expectation that had been placed upon her since birth, all of it stood on one side of the decision. On the other side was the unknown, represented by a young man who offered her nothing but uncertainty and the possibility of freedom. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post with quick, efficient movements. Sarah May could see that he had dressed for the occasion, trading his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt and his best vest, though his boots still bore the dust of hard travel. He carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who knew he was about to fight for something precious. "Miss Thompson?" Ezekiel's voice had moved closer to her door. "Your mother tells me you might need a moment to compose yourself. I understand that weddings can be overwhelming for young ladies, but I assure you there's nothing to be nervous about." Sarah May heard the condescension in his tone, the assumption that her hesitation was merely feminine nerves rather than genuine reluctance. In that moment, she realized that this conversation, this dismissal of her feelings as unimportant, would be repeated countless times throughout their marriage. Ezekiel Hartwell was not a cruel man, but he was a man who had never considered that women might have valid reasons for their emotions. A knock at the front door echoed through the house, followed by her mother's surprised voice. "Oh, Mr. Morrison, isn't it? What brings you here today?" "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson." Jake's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have urgent business to discuss with you and Miss Thompson." "I'm afraid this isn't a convenient time," Martha replied, confusion evident in her tone. "As you can see, we're preparing for Sarah May's wedding." "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware of that," Jake said, his voice respectful but determined. "That's exactly what I need to discuss with you." Sarah May heard Ezekiel's heavier footsteps moving toward the front door, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when asserting his position. "Mrs. Thompson, perhaps I should handle this. Young man, I don't believe we've been introduced." "I'm Ezekiel Hartwell, Jake Morrison, sir," Jake replied, and Sarah May could picture him removing his hat in the gesture of respect that good manners demanded, even in confrontation. "I work cattle for the Brennan Ranch." "I see." Ezekiel's voice carried the dismissive note of a man who considered cowboys to be barely above hired hands in the social hierarchy. "Well, Mr. Morrison, as you can see, this is a private family occasion. Whatever business you believe you have here can surely wait until after the wedding." "I'm afraid it can't, sir," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "My business concerns the bride herself." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah May could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She knew that her mother and Ezekiel were exchanging glances, trying to understand what a cowboy could possibly want with Sarah May on her wedding day. "I beg your pardon." Ezekiel's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Are you suggesting that you have some claim on my intended bride?" "I'm suggesting that Miss Thompson deserves the right to choose her own future," Jake replied, his voice growing stronger. "And I'm here to offer her an alternative to this marriage." Sarah May heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by Ezekiel's harsh laugh. "An alternative? Young man, I don't know what romantic notions you may have developed, but Sarah May Thompson is contracted to marry me today. The arrangements have been made, the debts settled, the agreements signed. Agreements that Miss Thompson herself never consented to," Jake countered. "Sir, with all due respect, we're not living in medieval times. A woman can't be sold to pay her family's debts, regardless of what contracts you may have signed with." "Her mother sold?" Ezekiel's voice rose with indignation. "I resent the implication, Mr. Morrison. This is a proper marriage arrangement, beneficial to all parties involved. Sarah May will want for nothing as my wife." "Accept the right to choose her own husband," Jake replied. "Accept the right to marry for love rather than obligation. Accept the right to live her own life instead of the one you've planned for her." Sarah May realized that she was holding her breath, listening to two men argue over her future as if she weren't capable of making her own decisions. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even Jake, who claimed to be offering her freedom, was doing so by confronting the men in her life rather than speaking directly to her. Making a decision that surprised even herself, Sarah May opened her bedroom door and stepped into the front room. All three adults turned to look at her, and she saw her reflection multiplied in their eyes, her mother's desperate hope that she would submit quietly, Ezekiel's confident assumption that she would honor their agreement, and Jake's uncertain faith that she would choose freedom over security. "I believe," Sarah May said, her voice steadier than she had expected, "that any discussion about my future should include me." Martha stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Sarah May, you're overwrought. This is neither the time nor the place for such dramatics. Mr. Morrison, I must ask you to leave immediately." "No, Mama," Sarah May replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Mr. Morrison is right. I should have a say in who I marry and how I spend my life." Ezekiel moved closer to her, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "My dear Sarah May, I understand that weddings can be stressful, but you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. We have an agreement, one that benefits your entire family. Surely you don't intend to break your word over a moment of nervous uncertainty?" "It's not nervous uncertainty," Sarah May replied, meeting his eyes directly. "It's the realization that I don't want to marry you, Mr. Hartwell. I never wanted to marry you. This entire arrangement was made without consulting my wishes or considering my feelings." The room fell silent again, and Sarah May could see the shock on her mother's face. the anger building in Ezekiel's expression, and the hope beginning to kindle in Jake's eyes. "Sarah May," Martha said weakly, "you don't know what you're saying. Without this marriage, we'll lose everything. The farm, the house, our entire way of life." "And with this marriage, I'll lose myself," Sarah May replied, turning to face her mother fully. "Mama, I know you believe you're doing what's best for me, but you're not. You're trading my happiness for financial security, and that's not a bargain I'm willing to make." Ezekiel stepped forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used in business negotiations. "Sarah May, I think you're being influenced by romantic notions that have little bearing on reality. Marriage is a practical institution, designed to provide mutual benefit and security. Love, if it develops, is a pleasant addition, but it's not essential for a successful union." "Maybe not for you," Sarah May replied, "but it is for me. I won't spend my life with a man who sees me as an acquisition rather than a partner." "And what does this cowboy offer you instead?" Ezekiel's voice turned sharp with disdain. "Poverty, uncertainty, a life of hardship following cattle drives and living in temporary camps?" Sarah May looked at Jake, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered by sun and wind, his hands too calloused from hard work, but his eyes held something that Ezekiel's never had, the recognition that she was a person worthy of respect and consideration. "He offers me choice," Sarah May said simply, "the chance to build a life based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation." Jake stepped forward, removing his hat completely and holding it in both hands. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Hartwell, I want to be clear about what I'm offering. I have $500 saved from 3 years of cattle work. It's enough to get Sarah May and me to California, where I have a job waiting on a ranch near Sacramento. I can't promise luxury or ease, but I can promise that Sarah May will be treated as an equal partner in whatever life we build together." $500, Ezekiel scoffed. "Sarah May, this man is offering you a few $100 and a vague promise of work in California. I'm offering you security, position, a beautiful home, and everything money can buy." "But not love," Sarah May said quietly. "Not partnership, not the freedom to be myself." Martha sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "Sarah May, if you do this, if you run away with him, we'll be ruined. The entire community will know that you broke your engagement on your wedding day. The scandal will destroy us." Sarah May felt her resolve waver at the sight of her mother's distress. The Thompson family had lived in this community for 3 generations. Their reputation, their standing, their entire social structure would indeed be shattered if she fled with Jake Morrison, and the debts would remain, crushing and inescapable. "Mama," she said gently, kneeling beside her mother's chair, "what kind of life are you asking me to live? Would you want to wake up every morning next to a man you didn't choose, in a house that felt like a prison, bound by obligations you never agreed to?" "It's what women do," Martha replied, her voice muffled by her hands. "It's what I did when I married your father. It's what my mother did and her mother before her. We make sacrifices for our families." "But did it make you happy?" Sarah May asked. "Were you truly content with a marriage based on duty rather than affection?" Martha looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Happiness is a luxury, Sarah May. Survival is what matters. Maybe for your generation," Sarah May replied, "but I believe I can have both. I believe I deserve both." Ezekiel's patience finally snapped. "This is ridiculous. Sarah May, you're being influenced by romantic nonsense. This cowboy is offering you nothing but hardship and uncertainty. In 5 years, you'll be living in some godforsaken frontier town, wondering what happened to your youth and beauty while he drinks away his wages in saloons." Jake's face flushed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. Mr. Hartwell, you don't know me well enough to make such accusations. I don't drink, I don't gamble, and I've never mistreated a woman in my life. What I'm offering Sarah may not be wealth, but it's honest work and genuine respect. Respect doesn't pay bills or put food on the table, Ezekiel retorted. Sarah May, be practical. You're 18 years old with no experience of the world beyond this county. You have no idea what real hardship looks like. And you have no idea what it feels like to have your entire future decided by others. Sarah May shot back, her own anger finally breaking through her careful composure. You speak of practicality, Mr. Hartwell. But what's practical about a marriage where the bride feels like livestock at auction? The harsh words hung in the air, and Sarah May saw Ezekiel's face darken with genuine anger for the first time. That's quite enough, he said coldly. Sarah May, you're clearly overwrought and not thinking clearly. I'm willing to overlook this outburst, but we need to leave for the church immediately. Our guests are waiting. Then they'll be disappointed, Sarah May replied, standing and smoothing her wedding dress with hands that were surprisingly steady. Because I won't be there. She turned to Jake, seeing hope and determination warring with uncertainty in his expression. Jake Morrison, are you truly offering me a partnership? A marriage based on equality and respect? I am, Jake replied without hesitation. Sarah May, I can't promise you'll never face hardship or uncertainty, but I can promise you'll never face it alone. Whatever challenges come, we'll meet them together as equals. Sarah May looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of the three people who had shaped this moment. Her mother, devastated, but perhaps beginning to understand. Ezekiel, furious at having his carefully laid plans disrupted. And Jake, offering her something she had never dared to hope for, the chance to choose her own destiny. Then I accept, Sarah May said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Jake Morrison, I'll go with you to California, and I'll marry you when we get there. The silence that followed was broken by Ezekiel's harsh laugh. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Sarah May. When you're living in poverty in some frontier hovel, remember that you chose it over everything. I offered you. I will remember, Sarah May replied calmly, and I'll be grateful every day that I had the courage to choose. She turned to her mother, seeing the pain and fear in Martha's eyes, but also something that might have been a grudging respect. Mama, I'm sorry for the scandal this will cause, but I'm not sorry for choosing my own future. I hope someday you'll understand. Martha rose from her chair and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. I understand more than you know, she whispered. I just pray you're strong enough for the path you're choosing. As Sarah May pulled away from her mother's embrace, she realized that the wedding dress she wore had become a costume for a play. She was no longer willing to perform. I need to change clothes, she said practically. I can't travel to California in a wedding gown. We need to leave soon, Jake said urgently. Word will spread quickly, and there are men in this county who won't take kindly to seeing Mr. Hartwell's plans disrupted. Sarah May nodded, understanding the implicit threat. Ezekiel Hartwell was a powerful man with powerful friends, and her rejection of his proposal would be seen as an insult that demanded response. If they were going to escape, they needed to do it quickly before organized pursuit could be mounted. As she turned toward her bedroom to change clothes, Sarah May caught sight of herself in the mirror one last time. The young woman looking back at her no longer looked like a trapped animal. She looked like someone who had discovered her own strength, her own worth, her own power to shape her destiny. In a few minutes, she would walk out of this house and away from everything she had ever known. She would climb onto a horse behind Jake Morrison and ride toward an uncertain future in a distant state. She would face scandal, hardship, and challenges she couldn't even imagine. And for the first time in months, Sarah May Thompson smiled with genuine happiness. Sarah May's hands moved with surprising steadiness as she stripped off the elaborate wedding dress and reached for her riding clothes. Each layer of silk and lace that fell to the floor felt like another chain being broken, another expectation being cast aside. In the front room, she could hear muffled voices, Jake's calm explanations, her mother's tearful protests, and Ezekiel's increasingly angry demands that she honor their agreement. She pulled on her most practical dress, a sturdy brown wool that would hold up to travel, and her father's old leather boots that had been carefully maintained despite their age. From her small jewelry box, she took only her mother's wedding ring, not the one Martha currently wore, but the simple gold band that had belonged to Sarah May's grandmother. Everything else, all the pretty trinkets that marked her as a young lady of modest means, she left behind. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. Sarah May? It was her mother's voice, barely above a whisper. "May I come in?" Sarah May opened the door to find Martha standing in the hallway, her face streaked with tears, but her expression more composed than it had been minutes earlier. Behind her, Sarah May could see Jake standing near the front door, while Ezekiel paced the front room like a caged animal, his earlier confidence replaced by frustrated rage. "Mama," Sarah May began, but Martha held up a hand to stop her. "I have something for you," Martha said quietly, pressing a small cloth bundle into her daughter's hands. "It's not much, but it's all the money I've managed to save over the past 2 years. $43. It won't solve our problems, but it might help you start your new life." Sarah May stared at the bundle, knowing what sacrifice it represented. $43 was a fortune to a woman in Martha's position, money that had probably been scraped together penny by penny from household savings and small economies. "Mama, I can't take this. You'll need it for what?" Martha interrupted, her voice sharp with pain. "For paying debts that will never truly be paid? For maintaining a farm that barely provides enough to survive? Sarah May, if you're determined to do this, then at least let me help you do it safely." Sarah May embraced her mother fiercely, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender water and hard work that had defined her childhood. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry for the scandal, for the disappointment, for leaving you to face this alone." "You're not leaving me alone," Martha replied, pulling back to look at her daughter's face. "You're showing me that it's possible to choose courage over comfort. I married your father because it was expected, because it was safe, because I was too frightened to imagine any other future. I won't let fear make that choice for you." From the front room came the sound of Ezekiel's voice rising in anger. "This is preposterous. The entire arrangement is legally binding. There are contracts, obligations, expectations from the entire community." "Mr. Hartwell," Jake's voice remained steady despite the obvious tension, "I understand your disappointment, but Sarah May has the right to change her mind. No contract can force a woman into marriage against her will." "Don't lecture me about rights, Cowboy," Ezekiel snapped. "You're stealing another man's bride, disrupting carefully made plans, and encouraging a young woman to destroy her family's reputation. There's nothing honorable about what you're doing." Sarah May stepped into the front room, her traveling bag in one hand and her mother's money secured in her pocket. Both men turned to look at her, and she saw her transformation reflected in their faces. Gone was the elaborate wedding gown and the carefully styled hair. In their place was a young woman dressed for travel, for uncertainty, for whatever challenges lay ahead. "Mr. Hartwell," she said formally, "I want to thank you for your consideration over these past months. I know you intended to provide me with security and comfort, and I don't doubt that you would have been an adequate husband in many ways." "Adequate?" Ezekiel's eyebrows rose at what he clearly considered an insult. "Sarah May, I would have given you everything. A beautiful home, fine clothes, social position, financial security for the rest of your life." "Yes," Sarah May agreed, "but you would never have given me partnership. you would never have asked. My opinion about important decisions, never considered that I might have valuable insights, never treated me as anything more than a particularly prized possession. Ezekiel's face darkened. And this cowboy will? Sarah May, you're romanticizing a hard life that will strip away your youth and beauty within a few years. When you're living in some primitive cabin, struggling to put food on the table, you'll remember what you gave up today. Perhaps, Sarah May acknowledged, but I'd rather struggle for something I believe in than live comfortably with something I despise. Jake stepped forward, his expression serious. Sarah May, Mr. Hartwell isn't wrong about the hardships we'll face. I need you to understand that the journey to California will be dangerous. We'll be traveling through territory where law enforcement is sparse, where bandits prey on travelers, where weather and terrain can kill the unprepared. Even if we reach California safely, life there won't be easy. Are you certain you're prepared for such challenges? Sarah May looked at Jake, appreciating his honesty, even as it revealed the magnitude of what she was undertaking. I'm not certain of anything except that I can't live the life that's been planned for me. I'd rather face uncertainty with someone who respects me than security with someone who sees me as property. Then we need to leave immediately, Jake said, glancing toward the window where the afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower. Word of what's happened here will spread quickly, and we need to be well away from Millfield before anyone decides to organize pursuit. Pursuit? Martha asked, alarm evident in her voice. Surely no one would... Mrs. Thompson, Jake said gently, your daughter is breaking an engagement to one of the most powerful men in 3 counties. There are people who will see that as an insult that demands response, regardless of the law. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses could be heard in the distance. Ezekiel moved to the window, his face grim as he peered through the lace curtains. It's my foreman, Collins, with 3 of my men. I sent word for them to come to the church if we were delayed. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, then stopped as he clearly reconsidered the wisdom of drawing a weapon in front of 2 women. How many men does Hartwell employ? He asked Martha quietly. Dozens, Martha replied, her face pale with understanding. Ranch hands, guards for his cattle drives, men who owe their livelihoods to his goodwill. Sarah May felt a chill of fear as she realized that her romantic notion of escape was about to collide with the harsh reality of frontier justice. Men like Ezekiel, Hartwell didn't accept public humiliation quietly, and the law in rural Texas was often whatever the most powerful man in the county decided it should be. There's a back way out through the kitchen, Martha said urgently. The old root cellar leads to a tunnel that comes up near the creek. Your father built it during the war in case of Indian raids. Jake nodded grimly. How long will it take them to search the house? Not long, Ezekiel said, turning from the window with a cold smile. Collins is thorough, and he knows that harboring a runaway bride could be considered theft of property. I am not property, Sarah May said sharply, anger flaring at Ezekiel's casual dismissal of her humanity. In the eyes of the law, you might as well be, Ezekiel replied. Our marriage contract includes provisions for your family's debts. By running away, you're essentially stealing $4,500 from me. Sarah May felt the blood drain from her face. $4,500 was more money than most families in Texas saw in a decade. If Ezekiel could convince the local authorities that she was a thief, Jake could be charged as an accomplice. They wouldn't just be fleeing an unwanted marriage, they'd be fugitives from the law. That contract was signed without my consent, Sarah May protested. I never agreed to any of those terms. Your mother had legal authority to sign on your behalf, Ezekiel replied smoothly. Until you reach the age of 21, she can make binding agreements regarding your future. Jake stepped protectively closer to Sarah May. Mr. Hartwell, you know as well as I do that forced marriage went out with slavery. No judge in Texas is going to uphold a contract that treats a woman like chattel. Perhaps, Ezekiel conceded, but it will take months for such a case to work its way through the courts. In the meantime, you'd both be in jail awaiting trial. The sound of boots on the front porch ended the debate. Collins, Ezekiel's foreman, was a hard man with cold eyes who had served as the cattle baron's enforcer for more than a decade. Behind him came 3 ranch hands, all armed and all owing their livelihoods to Ezekiel's continued satisfaction. "Mr. Hartwell," Collins called through the door, "we got your message about trouble at the wedding. What do you need us to do?" Sarah May saw Jake's hand move toward his gun again, and she realized that the situation was about to escalate beyond words. If Jake drew his weapon, Collins and his men would respond in kind, and the peaceful farmhouse would become a battleground. "Wait," she said urgently, placing her hand on Jake's arm. "There's another way." She turned to face Ezekiel, drawing herself up to her full height with a dignity that would have made her grandmother proud. "Mr. Hartwell, you're a businessman. Everything to you is a transaction, a negotiation, a deal to be made. So let's make a deal." Ezekiel's eyebrows rose with interest despite his anger. "I'm listening. You want compensation for the money you've invested in this marriage arrangement? Very well. Give me 1 year to repay every penny you've spent on my behalf. The wedding dress, the reception preparations, the debts you've assumed, everything. If I can't repay you within 1 year, I'll return to Texas and honor our original agreement." Jake stared at her in shock. "Sarah May, you're talking about thousands of dollars. How could we possibly—" "We'll find a way," Sarah May said firmly, though her heart was pounding with the enormity of what she was proposing. "Mr. Hartwell, do you accept those terms?" Ezekiel studied her face for a long moment, clearly calculating. The odds that a runaway bride and a cowboy could accumulate such a sum in 12 months. "And if you fail to repay the money? If you default on this new agreement? Then I'll return and marry you as originally planned," Sarah May said, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "I'll be a dutiful wife and never speak of this day again." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Collins and his men waiting on the porch. Sarah May could see Jake struggling with her proposal, understanding that she was essentially gambling their entire future on their ability to succeed. In California. Finally, Ezekiel smiled, a cold, calculating expression that revealed his certainty that she would fail. "Very well, Sarah May. I accept your terms. You have 1 year from today to repay the sum of $4,500. When you fail, and you will fail, you'll return to Texas and become my wife without further protest." He moved to Martha's writing desk and quickly drafted a brief agreement outlining the terms they had discussed. With a flourish, he signed his name and handed the pen to Sarah May. "Your signature makes this official. 1 year, Sarah May. When you're living in poverty, in California, remember that you chose this path." Sarah May took the pen with a steady hand and signed her name to what might be either her salvation or her doom. As the ink dried, she realized that she had bought herself a year of freedom, but at a price that might ultimately cost her everything. "Collins," Ezekiel called to his foreman, "Miss Thompson and Mr. Morrison are free to leave. They have my permission to depart without interference." Through the window, Sarah May could see Collins gesture to his men, and the sound of their retreating footsteps echoed across the porch. Jake looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern, clearly struggling to understand what she had just committed them to. "We need to go," he said quietly. "We've lost enough time already." Sarah May embraced her mother one final time, feeling the weight of all the unspoken words between them. "I love you, Mama. I'll write when I can." "Be careful," Martha whispered. "Be strong. And remember that you carry 3 generations of Thompson women with you wherever you go." As they prepared to leave through the kitchen door, Sarah May took one last look around the home where she had grown to womanhood. Everything looked exactly the same, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In signing that agreement with Ezekiel, she had transformed her romantic escape into a desperate race against time. She had 1 year to prove that freedom was worth any price. Jake's horse was waiting where he had left it, along with a second mount that Sarah May realized he must have brought specifically for her escape. As he helped her into the saddle, she felt the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy cloak. They rode away from the Thompson farmhouse as the sun began to set over the Texas prairie, two figures silhouetted against the vast sky, heading toward an uncertain future, with nothing but hope and determination to sustain them. Behind them, the life Sarah May had always known grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, lost in the gathering dusk of a day that had changed everything. The real adventure was just beginning. The first night of their journey found Sarah May and Jake camped beside a small creek 30 miles west of Millfield, far enough from civilization that the only sounds were wind through the mesquite trees and the distant howl of coyotes. Sarah May sat close to their carefully shielded campfire, her traveling dress already showing the effects of hard riding, while Jake tended to their horses with the methodical care of a man who understood that their lives might depend on the animal's condition. "We'll reach Fort Worth in 3 days if we maintain this pace," Jake said, settling down beside her with a plate of beans and hardtack that represented their evening meal. "From there, we can join a wagon train heading west, or we can continue on our own if we think it's safer." Sarah May accepted the simple food gratefully, surprised by how hungry the day's ride had made her. "What do you think would be safer?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Wagon trains offer protection in numbers, but they also move slowly and attract attention. Bandits know to watch the main routes for groups of travelers with valuable supplies. On our own, we can move faster and avoid the most dangerous areas, but we'd be more vulnerable if we do encounter trouble. The weight of their situation settled over Sarah May like a physical presence. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been finding the courage to refuse an unwanted marriage. Now she was a fugitive from her old life, carrying a debt of $4,500 and facing a journey of more than 1,000 miles through some of the most dangerous territory in America. "Jake," she said quietly, "do you think I made the right choice? When I signed that agreement with Ezekiel, I committed us both to an almost impossible task. $4,500 is more money than most people see in a lifetime." Jake set down his plate and turned to face her fully. "Sarah May, let me tell you something about impossible tasks. 3 years ago, I was working as a hired hand for $15 a month, sleeping in a barn and eating leftovers from my employer's table. Everyone told me it was impossible for someone like me to save enough money to start my own life, to become anything more than another drifter following cattle drives until I was too old to work." He gestured toward the horses grazing nearby. "Those animals represent 3 years of saving every penny I could, of working double shifts and taking on the jobs nobody else wanted. People said it was impossible, but I did it anyway. Sometimes the impossible is just what people call something they don't have the courage to attempt." Sarah May found herself studying Jake's face in the firelight, seeing determination there that reminded her of her own decision to reject the safe path in favor of the unknown. "But this is different. We're not just trying to save money. We're trying to build an entirely new life in a place we've never seen, doing work we've never done." "You're right," Jake agreed. "It is different. It's harder, more uncertain, more dangerous than anything either of us has ever attempted. But Sarah May, consider the alternative. If you had married Ezekiel Hartwell, where would you be 20 years from now?" Sarah May tried to imagine that future. A grand house in Millfield, children who called Ezekiel father, social obligations and charitable committees, and all the trappings of being a cattle baron's wife. It would have been comfortable, respectable, secure and utterly empty of anything resembling joy or personal fulfillment. "I would have been safe," she said finally. "Would you have been alive?" Jake asked. "Really alive in any way that mattered?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah May realized that Jake had identified the heart of her dilemma. She could have had security, but only by surrendering everything that made her who she was, the woman who would have emerged. From 20 years of marriage to Ezekiel, Hartwell would have been a stranger, someone whose dreams and ambitions had been slowly strangled by comfort and convention. "Tell me about California," she said, changing the subject to something more hopeful. "What exactly are we riding toward?" Jake's expression brightened, and Sarah May could see the dreams that had sustained him through 3 years of hard work and careful saving. "The ranch where I'll be working is in the Sacramento Valley, about 50 miles east of San Francisco. The owner, Thomas Whitmore, is a different kind of man than Ezekiel Hartwell. He built his ranch with his own hands, and he believes in rewarding good work with partnership rather than just wages. Partnership. After 5 years of faithful service, ranch hands can buy into the operation as junior partners. It's not charity. You have to prove your worth and invest your own money, but it's a chance to build something lasting instead of just working for someone else's profit." Sarah May felt a spark of excitement at the possibility Jake was describing. "And wives? What role do wives play in this partnership arrangement?" Jake smiled, understanding the real question behind her words. "Sarah May, this isn't Texas. In California, women own businesses, manage property, and make decisions that affect entire communities. Thomas Whitmore's wife, Elena, keeps the books for the ranch and handles all the business correspondence. She's partners with her husband in every sense of the word." The image Jake painted was so different from anything Sarah May had experienced that it seemed almost fantastical. In Texas, respectable women managed households and raised children, leaving business decisions to their husbands. The idea that she might actually contribute to important decisions, that her opinions might be valued and her skills utilized, was both thrilling and terrifying. "But we still have to get there first," she said practically. "And we have to find a way to earn $4,500 within a year. Jake, do you have any idea how we're going to accomplish that?" Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with the magnitude of the challenge they had accepted. "I've been thinking about that all day. My job at the Whitmore Ranch will pay $60 a month plus room and board. That's good wages. But even if I could save every penny, it would take more than 6 years to accumulate $4,500. Sarah May felt her heart sink as the mathematical reality of their situation became clear. "So we need to find additional sources of income. But what skills do I have that would be valuable in California?" "More than you realize," Jake said firmly. "You can read and write better than most men I know. You understand figures and bookkeeping. You speak well and present yourself with dignity. Those are valuable skills anywhere, but especially in a place where civilization is still being built." As they discussed possibilities, teaching, keeping books for local businesses, perhaps even starting some kind of small enterprise, Sarah May found herself both encouraged and overwhelmed by the scope of what they were attempting. They weren't just fleeing an unwanted marriage. They were trying to reinvent themselves completely, to become people they had never imagined they could be. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made Jake freeze instantly, the distant drumming of approaching horses. He was on his feet immediately, his hand on his gun, motioning for Sarah May to move away from the firelight. "How many?" she whispered, impressed by her own calm in the face of potential danger. Jake listened intently, his head cocked toward the sound. 3, maybe 4 riders, moving fast but trying to be quiet about it. Sarah May's mind raced through the possibilities. Bandits were common on the frontier roads, but so were legitimate travelers. More concerning was the possibility that Ezekiel had decided their agreement wasn't worth honoring, that he had sent men to bring her back, regardless of what she had signed. "Could it be Collins and his men?" she asked quietly. "Possible," Jake replied grimly, "though I'd have expected them to wait until morning to track us. Hunting people in the dark is dangerous business, even for experienced trackers." The sound of the horses grew closer, and Sarah May could see Jake calculating distances and angles, preparing for whatever confrontation might be coming. She realized that she had never seen him in a truly dangerous situation before, and she was both reassured and disturbed by the cold competence he displayed. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "if something happens to you, what should I do?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious but not frightened. "If shooting starts, you get behind those rocks over there and stay down until it's over. If I don't make it out of this, you take the horses and ride north toward Fort Worth. Find the sheriff and tell him what happened. And then," Jake's smile was grim but determined, "then you keep going to California anyway. Sarah May, don't let my stupidity in getting us caught become the reason you go back to a life you don't want." The horses were close enough now that Sarah May could hear individual hoofbeats, could distinguish between the animals, and count at least 3 distinct mounts. Jake motioned for her to move toward the rocks he had indicated, but before she could comply, a voice called out from the darkness, "Hello, the camp. We're looking for 2 riders who pass this way. Mind if we approach?" Jake relaxed slightly at the courteous hail, but his hand remained near his weapon. "Come ahead slowly," he called back. "Keep your hands where we can see them." 3 men rode into the circle of firelight, and Sarah May felt relief wash over her as she realized they weren't Collins and his men. These were strangers, travel-worn and tired-looking, but not carrying themselves like men bent on violence. The leader, a man of perhaps 40 with graying hair and intelligent eyes, dismounted and approached their fire with his hands clearly visible. "Name's Samuel Crawford," he said politely. "These are my associates, Mr. Bennett and Mr. Hayes. We're deputy marshals out of Austin, tracking a pair of bank robbers who hit the Millfield Bank 3 days ago." Sarah May felt her blood turn to ice. 3 days ago was the day of her supposed wedding, the day she and Jake had fled Millfield. If these men were looking for bank robbers, and if someone had described her and Jake as suspicious characters leaving town... "Bank robbers?" Jake asked carefully. "Can't say we've seen anyone matching that description." "What did these men look like?" Crawford studied Jake's face intently. "About your age, traveling with a woman. The witnesses said they were riding hard when they left town, heading west toward Fort Worth." Sarah May realized that their escape had been mistaken for something far more serious, that they were now being hunted not just by Ezekiel's men, but by federal law enforcement. The irony was bitter. In trying to escape one trap, they had fallen into another. "Marshal Crawford," Jake said slowly, "I think there may be some confusion here. My name is Jake Morrison, and this is my fiancée, Sarah May Thompson. We left Millfield yesterday, but not because we robbed any bank." Crawford's eyes sharpened with interest. "Thompson, as in the Thompson family that was supposed to be attending a wedding yesterday?" "That's right," Sarah May said, stepping forward, despite Jake's protective gesture. "Marshal, I was supposed to marry Ezekiel Hartwell yesterday, but I changed my mind at the last moment. Jake and I are traveling to California to start a new life together." The 3 lawmen exchanged glances, and Sarah May could see them processing this information, comparing it to whatever they had been told about the bank robbery. "Miss Thompson," Crawford said carefully, "are you traveling willingly with Mr. Morrison? Has he threatened you or coerced you in any way?" The question revealed how her situation appeared to outside observers, a young woman from a respectable family, traveling unchaperoned with a cowboy, fleeing on what should have been her wedding day. In the eyes of the law, Jake could easily be seen as a kidnapper rather than a rescuer. I'm traveling entirely of my own free will, Sarah May said firmly. Marshal Crawford, I signed a legal agreement with Mr. Hartwell yesterday, witnessed by my mother, that gives me 1 year to repay certain debts before I would be obligated to honor my marriage contract. Jake and I are not fugitives from anything except an unwanted marriage. Crawford considered this explanation, clearly trying to decide whether it was believable or an elaborate cover story. And the bank robbery? The timing seems rather convenient. What bank robbery? Jake asked. Marshal, we've been on the trail since yesterday afternoon. We haven't been near Millfield since we left, and we certainly haven't robbed any banks. Deputy Bennett, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up for the first time. Sam, look at their gear. These folks are traveling light, but they're prepared for a long journey. Bank robbers would be carrying more cash, better weapons, and they'd be moving faster. Crawford nodded slowly, apparently reaching the same conclusion. Mr. Morrison, Miss Thompson, I believe your story, but I need to warn you about something. Word has already spread about your departure from Millfield, and not everyone sees it as a romantic elopement. There are men who view what you've done as theft, and they may not be as concerned with legal niceties as we are. What do you mean? Sarah May asked, though she suspected she already knew. I mean that Ezekiel Hartwell has money and influence, and men with money and influence don't like being made to look foolish in public. That agreement you signed may protect you legally, but it won't protect you from someone who decides to take justice into his own hands. The marshal's warning confirmed Sarah May's worst fears about their situation. They weren't just racing against time to repay a debt. They were being hunted by men who might not be bound by the legal agreements they had made. Marshal, Jake said, quietly, what would you advise us to do? Crawford remounted his horse and gathered his reins. Get to California as fast as you can and stay off the main roads while you're doing it. And Mr. Morrison, keep that gun of yours handy. The frontier can be an unforgiving place for people who challenge the established order. As the three lawmen rode away into the darkness, Sarah May and Jake were left alone with the sobering realization that their journey had become far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. They were no longer just lovers fleeing toward a new life. They were potential targets for anyone who saw their defiance as a threat to the social order that kept men like Ezekiel Hartwell in power. We should put out the fire and move to a new campsite, Jake said practically. If the marshals found us this easily, others might be able to do the same. As they broke camp and loaded their few possessions back onto the horses, Sarah May found herself thinking about the path they had chosen. Each mile they traveled took them further from everything familiar and deeper into uncertainty. But each mile also took them closer to the possibility of a life built on their own terms, where partnership and mutual respect mattered more than social position or financial security. The road ahead was dark and dangerous, but it was their road, chosen, freely and traveled willingly. For Sarah May, that made all the difference in the world. Fort Worth bustled with the energy of a frontier city on the edge of transformation. After 5 days of hard riding through increasingly desolate country, Sarah May found herself overwhelmed by the chaos of streets filled with cattle drovers, freight wagons, and travelers from every corner of America. The air rang with a dozen languages as men negotiated deals for livestock, supplies, and passage to destinations scattered across the Western Territories. Jake guided their horses through the crowded streets with the confidence of someone who had navigated such places before, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, while Sarah May marveled at the diversity surrounding them. She had never seen so many different kinds of people in one place. Mexican vaqueros with silver-studded saddles, German immigrants speaking in their native tongue, freed slaves heading west to claim homesteads, and weathered mountain men who looked as if they hadn't seen civilization in years. We need supplies, information about the trails ahead, and a safe place to rest the horses, Jake said, as they dismounted outside a modest boarding house that advertised clean rooms and honest rates. But we also need to be careful about who we talk to. Word travels fast in places like this, and we can't afford to have our business become common knowledge. Sarah May nodded, understanding the wisdom of his caution. Fort Worth was a crossroads, where travelers from across Texas converged, and it would be easy for information about their presence to reach the wrong ears. They had already established false names for use in public. She was Mary Johnson, and he was Tom Wilson, a married couple heading to Oregon Territory to claim farmland. The boarding house proprietor, a weathered woman named Mrs. Carson, asked a few questions as she showed them to a small but clean room on the second floor. "You folks traveling with a wagon train?" she asked casually, as Jake paid for 3 nights' lodging. "We're considering our options," Jake replied non-committally. "What can you tell us about the trails heading west from here?" Mrs. Carson's expression grew serious. "Depends on where you're headed and what risks you're willing to take. The Santa Fe Trail is well established but heavily traveled, which means more bandits and higher competition for water and grazing. The northern route through Colorado Territory is safer from outlaws, but harder on livestock, especially this time of year." "What about going through New Mexico Territory?" Sarah May asked, remembering Jake's earlier mention of multiple possible routes. "Possible," Mrs. Carson acknowledged, "but you'd be crossing Apache country, and tensions have been running high since the troubles at Silver Creek last month. A wagon train got hit hard, lost 6 people, and most of their livestock." As they discussed the various options, Sarah May began to understand why Jake had been so concerned about the dangers of their journey. Each possible route presented different risks, and their choice could literally mean the difference between life and death. Later that evening, as they ate dinner in the boarding house's common room, Sarah May noticed a well-dressed man at a corner table who seemed to be paying unusual attention to their conversation. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the soft hands and expensive clothes of someone who made his living with his mind rather than his back, and his eyes held the calculating look of a professional gambler. "Jake," she said quietly, "don't look directly, but there's a man at the corner table who's been watching us since we sat down." Jake's posture didn't change, but Sarah May could see his awareness sharpen. "Can you describe him without being obvious about it?" Sarah May pretended to butter her bread while stealing glances at their observer. "Well-dressed, expensive watch chain, soft hands. He looks like a businessman, or maybe a professional gambler." "Could be either," Jake murmured, "or he could be someone Hartwell hired to track us. Professional bounty hunters often dress well. It helps them blend in among respectable travelers." The possibility that they were being watched by a bounty hunter sent a chill through Sarah May. She had assumed that once they left Texas, they would be relatively safe from Ezekiel's reach. But apparently her former fiancé's influence extended further than she had imagined. Their meal was interrupted when the well-dressed man rose from his table and approached them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his overtures welcomed. "Excuse me," he said with a slight bow. "I couldn't help but overhear that you folks are planning to travel west. Perhaps I might be of assistance." Jake's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's kind of you, Mr. Blackwood, James Blackwood." The man extended a manicured hand. "I represent a consortium of investors interested in westward expansion, and I make it my business to help travelers reach their destinations safely and profitably." Sarah May felt her suspicion deepen. Legitimate businessmen didn't typically approach strangers in boarding house dining rooms, and Blackwood's manner was too smooth, too practiced. "What kind of assistance?" Jake asked, accepting the handshake but remaining wary. "Well," Blackwood said, settling into an empty chair without being invited, "I understand you're considering various routes to the Pacific coast. As it happens, I'm organizing a small, select group of travelers who will be taking a particularly advantageous path through Arizona territory. We have experienced guides, adequate protection, and connections that ensure safe passage through potentially difficult areas. That sounds expensive, Sarah May said carefully, testing Blackwood's reaction to the suggestion that they might not have significant funds. Blackwood's smile never wavered. Actually, my dear lady, we're more interested in capable people than wealthy ones. Your husband appears to be an experienced horseman, and you strike me as an educated woman who could contribute valuable skills to our enterprise. The flattery felt calculated, and Sarah May noticed that Blackwood had neatly sidestepped the question of cost. What kind of enterprise are you talking about, Mr. Blackwood? Import and export, primarily. There are tremendous opportunities for profit in moving goods between the established markets of California and the developing territories of the Southwest. A couple like yourselves could earn substantial sums by participating in such ventures. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your offer, but my wife and I prefer to make our own way. We're not looking for get-rich-quick schemes. Of course, Blackwood replied smoothly. I completely understand your caution. Perhaps you'd be interested in a smaller commitment. I happen to know of a wagon train leaving Fort Worth tomorrow morning, led by an excellent trail boss named Captain Reynolds. They're taking the southern route through El Paso, and they have room for 2 more travelers. This offer sounded more legitimate, and Sarah May could see Jake considering it seriously. Traveling with a legitimate wagon train would provide safety, in numbers and experienced leadership, both of which they desperately needed. What would be the cost for passage? Jake asked. $50 per person. Plus you'd be expected to take your turn at guard duty and help with the communal work of the train, Blackwood replied. It's a fair arrangement, and Captain Reynolds runs a tight operation. $100 represented, a significant portion of their limited resources, but Sarah May could see the logic in Blackwood's proposal. They needed experienced guidance to navigate the dangers ahead, and attempting the journey alone was becoming increasingly risky. We'll think about it, Jake said diplomatically. Where could we find Captain Reynolds if we decide to join his train? The wagon camp is about 2 miles north of town, near the old trading post, Blackwood replied, rising from his chair. But don't wait too long to decide. Reynolds plans to leave at first light, and he won't delay for latecomers. After Blackwood departed, Jake and Sarah May sat in thoughtful silence, each wrestling with the decision before them. Joining a wagon train would provide safety and guidance, but it would also mean subjecting themselves to the authority of strangers and potentially revealing more about their background than was safe. What do you think? Sarah May asked finally. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the dining room windows. I think Blackwood knows more about us than he's letting on. His approach was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Either he's working for someone who wants to keep track of our movements, or he's running some kind of confidence game. But the wagon train might be legitimate, Sarah May pointed out. Even if Blackwood has ulterior motives, Captain Reynolds might be exactly what we need. Possibly, Jake agreed. But if Blackwood is connected to Hartwell, joining his recommended wagon train could be walking into a trap. They spent the rest of the evening debating their options, but their discussion was cut short when Mrs. Carson approached their table with obvious concern etched on her weathered face. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, she said quietly, using their assumed names, I thought you should know that a man was here earlier asking questions about travelers matching your description. He claimed to be a deputy marshal, but something about him didn't sit right with me. Sarah May felt her blood run cold. What kind of questions? He wanted to know if a young couple had checked in recently, traveling light and looking like they were in a hurry. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description, but he seemed suspicious of my answers. Jake's expression grew grim. Mrs. Carson, did this man give you his name? called himself Deputy Collins, said he was tracking fugitives from Texas, but I've known plenty of real lawmen in my time, and this one didn't feel right. Too well-dressed, too smooth in his manner. Collins, Ezekiel's foreman. Sarah May realized that their pursuer had followed them to Fort Worth and was now actively searching for them. The safety they had hoped to find in the anonymity of a large frontier town was proving to be an illusion. "Mrs. Carson," Jake said urgently, "is there a back way out of this building? We may need to leave quickly and quietly." "There's a service stairs that leads to the alley behind the kitchen," she replied without hesitation. "And if you need fresh horses, my brother runs a livery stable 3 blocks east of here. Tell him Emma Carson sent you, and he'll treat you fair." Sarah May was struck by the woman's willingness to help complete strangers, apparently based on nothing more than her instinct that they were good people in trouble. It was a reminder that the frontier, for all its dangers, also fostered a spirit of mutual assistance that was rare in more settled areas. "Thank you," Sarah May said sincerely. "Your kindness means more than you know." As they quickly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave through the back stairs, Sarah May found herself thinking about the choice that lay before them. They could continue trying to outrun their pursuers, staying one step ahead through cunning and luck, or they could take the risk of joining Blackwood's wagon train, hoping that safety in numbers would outweigh the potential dangers of his questionable motives. "Jake," she said as they descended the narrow service stairs, "what if we approach Captain Reynolds directly, without going through Blackwood? If the wagon train is legitimate, we might be able to join it without involving ourselves with whatever scheme Blackwood is running." Jake paused on the stairs, considering her suggestion. "That could work, assuming we can find the wagon camp and convince Reynolds to take us on. But it also means traveling 2 miles outside of town, where we'd be vulnerable if this is some kind of ambush." They reached the alley behind the boarding house, where the darkness provided welcome concealment. Sarah May could hear the sounds of Fort Worth's nightlife continuing in the streets beyond. Laughter from saloons, the rattle of wagon wheels on wooden planks, the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards. All of it seemed very far away from their current predicament. "We need to make a decision," Jake said practically. "We can't spend the night hiding in alleys, and every hour we delay gives Collins more time to organize a search." Sarah May took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on her. 6 days ago, she had been a sheltered young woman whose biggest worry was finding the courage to refuse an unwanted marriage. Now she was a fugitive making life-or-death decisions in the back alleys of a frontier town, being hunted by men who saw her as stolen property. "Let's go find Captain Reynolds," she said finally. "If Blackwood's wagon train is legitimate, we'll join it. If it's a trap, at least we'll know what we're facing." As they made their way through the dark streets toward the livery stable, Sarah May reflected on how much her definition of courage had changed over the past week. She had once thought courage meant standing up in church and refusing to marry Ezekiel Hartwell. Now she understood that true courage was the willingness to keep moving forward even when every step led deeper into uncertainty. The livery stable was a ramshackle building that smelled of hay and horse sweat, presided over by a grizzled man who bore a strong resemblance to Mrs. Carson. When Jake mentioned his sister's name, the man's suspicious expression immediately softened. "Emma sent you? Then you must be in some kind of trouble," he said matter-of-factly. "What do you need?" "Information about a wagon train led by Captain Reynolds," Jake replied. "And possibly fresh horses if we decide to join it." The stable owner scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Reynolds is solid, been leading trains for 8 years without losing a wagon. But he's particular about who he takes on. Won't accept anyone who might bring trouble to the train." Sarah May exchanged a meaningful glance with Jake. Their entire situation was built around trouble they were trying to escape. Convincing Reynolds To accept them would require a careful balance of honesty and discretion. What would you advise? Jake asked. Be straight with him, the stable owner replied. Reynolds can smell a lie from a mile away, and he'd rather turn away honest people with problems than accept dishonest people who claim to have none. As they prepared to ride out to the wagon camp, Sarah May found herself hoping that Captain Reynolds would prove to be the kind of man who understood that sometimes good people found themselves in impossible situations through no fault of their own. Their future might well depend on convincing a stranger that they were worth the risk of helping. The night was clear and cold as they rode north from Fort Worth, following the directions they had been given toward what might be either their salvation or their doom. Behind them, Collins was somewhere in the darkness, continuing his search. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the possibility of finding allies in their desperate flight toward freedom. For the first time since leaving Texas, Sarah May allowed herself to hope that they might actually make it to California alive. The wagon camp sprawled across a natural meadow 2 miles north of Fort Worth, illuminated by the flickering light of a dozen campfires that cast dancing shadows across canvas-covered wagons and tethered livestock. Captain Reynolds proved to be a tall, weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked upon. He listened to Jake and Sarah May's carefully edited story, a young married couple seeking new opportunities in California, with the expression of someone who had heard countless similar tales and learned to separate truth from deception. "Mr. Wilson," Reynolds said finally, using Jake's assumed name, "I appreciate your honesty about being inexperienced with wagon train travel, but what you're proposing concerns me. You want to join a train leaving tomorrow morning. You're traveling without proper equipment or supplies, and you're clearly running from something, though you won't say what." Sarah May felt her heart sink as she realized that their desperation was more obvious than they had hoped. Captain Reynolds was exactly the kind of experienced, careful leader they needed, but that same experience made him wary of travelers who might bring trouble to his train. "Captain," she said, choosing her words carefully, "you're right that we're inexperienced and under-equipped, but we're also hard workers who are willing to learn and contribute however we can. As for running from something," she paused, meeting his eyes directly. "We're running from a life that would have destroyed everything good in both of us. Is that the kind of trouble you're worried about?" Reynolds studied her face for a long moment, clearly trying to read the truth behind her words. "Mrs. Wilson, in my experience, there are two kinds of people who talk about running from their old lives. Those who are trying to escape the consequences of their own bad choices, and those who are trying to escape other people's bad choices. Which category do you fall into?" The question was perceptive and fair, and Sarah May realized that Reynolds deserved an honest answer, even if it put them at risk. "The second category, Captain. We're trying to escape a marriage arrangement that was made without my consent and a social system that treats women as property to be bought and sold." "And the law?" Reynolds asked Jake. "Are there warrants out for either of you? Any reason why peace officers might come looking for you in my train?" Jake shook his head firmly. "No warrants, no crimes. We've broken no laws except the unwritten, ones that say a woman can't choose her own husband and a man can't help her do it." Reynolds was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between them as if trying to penetrate to their souls. Around them, the wagon camp continued its evening routine. Families preparing meals, men tending to livestock, children playing games around the campfires. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that Sarah May found herself longing to be part of. "I'll tell you what," Reynolds said finally. "I've got a family on this train, the Hendersons, who lost their oldest son to fever 2 weeks ago. They're good people, but they're short-handed now and struggling to manage their wagon and livestock. If you're willing to work for them in exchange for passage, and if they're willing to take you on, then you can come with us." Sarah May felt a surge of hope mixed with nervousness. Working for another family would mean subjecting themselves to their judgment and authority, but it would also provide the legitimate cover they desperately needed. "We'd be grateful for the opportunity," Jake said sincerely. "When could we meet the Hendersons?" "Right now," Reynolds replied, rising from his position beside the campfire. "They're camped about 100 yards that way, but I should warn you, Ben Henderson is particular about who he works with, and his wife, Rachel, has strong opinions about proper behavior. If they don't take to you, there won't be any second chances." As they walked through the wagon camp toward the Hendersons' site, Sarah May observed the careful organization that marked a well-run train. Wagons were positioned for mutual defense, livestock was properly secured, and guard posts were already established around the perimeter. These people understood the dangers of westward travel and had taken appropriate precautions. The Henderson family proved to be a study in frontier resilience. Ben Henderson was a compact, strong-looking man in his 40s, with calloused hands and a direct manner that spoke of someone accustomed to hard work and straight dealing. His wife, Rachel, was a small woman, with prematurely grey hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Their surviving children, 2 daughters and a younger son, watched the approaching strangers with curiosity mixed with wariness. "Captain, Reynolds says you folks might be interested in working passage to California," Ben said without preamble after introductions were made. "What kind of work experience do you have?" Jake answered honestly about his cattle-driving background, while Sarah May described her experience managing a household and helping with her father's business accounts. She could see Rachel Henderson evaluating her carefully, looking for signs of weakness or deception. "Mrs. Wilson," Rachel said finally, "can you cook for 12 people over an open fire? Can you tend sick animals? Can you walk 20 miles in a day if your riding horse goes lame?" "I can learn to do whatever needs to be done," Sarah May replied, meeting the woman's challenging gaze. "I may not have experience with frontier travel, but I have experience with hard work and making do with limited resources." Ben Henderson exchanged a meaningful look with his wife, some kind of silent communication passing between them. "Mr. Wilson, we lost our boy to fever, but we also lost the extra gun he represented. Can you shoot? Can you stand guard duty and defend this train if we're attacked?" "Yes, sir," Jake replied without hesitation. "I've been carrying a gun for 8 years and I know how to use it." "Prove it," Ben said, pointing toward a tin can sitting on a fence post about 50 yards away. "Put 3 shots in that can." Jake drew his revolver with smooth confidence, took careful aim, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. All 3 bullets struck the can, sending it spinning off the post. Around the camp, other travelers looked up at the sound of gunfire, but seeing that it was just a demonstration, they returned to their own activities. "That'll do," Ben said with obvious approval. "Now, Mrs. Wilson, Rachel has some questions for you." Rachel gestured for Sarah May to follow her to the back of their wagon, where she could speak more privately. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want a straight answer. Are you really married to that man?" Sarah May felt her cheeks flush with heat. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you don't act like a married woman," Rachel replied bluntly. "You defer to him in conversation, but not the way a wife defers to her husband. You watch him when he's talking, like you're still learning who he is, and you both have the kind of nervous energy that comes from being in a new situation together." The older woman's perceptiveness was both impressive and dangerous. Sarah May realized that she had to make a choice between maintaining their cover story and trusting someone who might become an ally. "We're not married yet," she admitted quietly, "but we're committed to each other, and we plan to marry when we reach California." Rachel's expression softened slightly. "Running away from an arranged marriage?" Sarah May nodded, surprised by the woman's understanding. "How did you know?" "Because I did the same thing 23 years ago," Rachel replied with a slight smile. Ran off with Ben when my father tried to marry me to his business partner, a man twice my age who already had 2 wives buried in the family cemetery. The revelation created an instant bond between the 2 women, and Sarah May felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Did you ever regret it? Not once, Rachel said firmly. Ben and I have had our hard times, lost children, faced dangers. You can't imagine, but we faced them together as equals. That's worth more than all the security in the world. When they returned to where the men were talking, Rachel nodded to her husband. I think these folks will work out fine, Ben. They're running from something, but it's not the law, and they're not afraid of honest work. Ben Henderson studied Jake's face for a long moment, then extended his hand. Mr. Wilson, welcome to the Henderson family. We leave at dawn and we work hard, but we take care of our own. As they shook hands, Sarah May felt a profound sense of relief. They had found not just passage to California, but the kind of surrogate family that could help them navigate the challenges ahead. The celebration was short-lived, however. As they were discussing the details of their arrangement with the Hendersons, a commotion arose from the direction of the camp entrance. Voices were raised in challenge and response, and Sarah May could see men reaching for their weapons. Riders coming in, someone called from the perimeter. 3 men moving fast. Sarah May's blood turned to ice as she recognized the possibility that Collins and his men had tracked them to the wagon camp. If they were discovered now, after finally finding safety with the Hendersons, it would be devastating. Captain Reynolds was already moving toward the source of the disturbance, his own weapon drawn and ready. "Who goes there?" he called into. "The darkness beyond the firelight, Deputy Marshal Crawford," came the reply. "We're tracking fugitives and need to search your camp." Sarah May recognized the voice of the lawman they had encountered on the trail, but her relief was tempered by confusion. Why would Crawford be searching for them when he had already cleared them of any connection to the bank robbery? Marshal. "Crawford," Reynolds called back, "you're welcome in our camp, but I need to see your credentials before I allow any searching." 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Sarah May was surprised to see that only one of them was actually Crawford. The other 2 were strangers, hard-looking men with the kind of weapons and equipment that suggested professional bounty hunters rather than legitimate lawmen. "Captain Reynolds," Crawford said formally, "we're looking for a man and woman who may have joined your train. The woman is wanted for questioning in connection with a breach of contract case, and the man may be involved in her unlawful departure from Texas." Sarah May felt Jake tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. This was clearly not a routine law enforcement inquiry, but some kind of legal maneuver orchestrated by Ezekiel Hartwell. Ben Henderson stepped protectively in front of both Sarah May and Jake, his own weapon now visible in his hand. "Marshal, what exactly are you accusing these people of?" Crawford's expression was uncomfortable, as if he weren't entirely pleased with the situation he found himself in. "Mr. Henderson, I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but I have a court order requiring me to bring in a couple matching their description for questioning." "What court?" Rachel Henderson demanded, moving to stand beside her husband. "What judge issued this order?" One of Crawford's companions, a thin man with cold eyes, spoke up for the first time. "That's not your concern, lady. We have legal authority to search this camp and arrest anyone who interferes with our duties." Sarah May realized that this was no longer about law enforcement, but about the power of money and influence to corrupt the legal system. Ezekiel had somehow managed to obtain official sanction for what amounted to kidnapping. "Marshal Crawford," Captain Reynolds said carefully, "I need to see that court order before I allow any arrests in my camp." Crawford reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, But Sarah May could see reluctance in his movements. As Reynolds examined the paper by firelight, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This order is signed by Judge Morton in Austin," Reynolds said finally. "It authorizes the arrest of one Sarah May Thompson and one Jake Morrison for questioning in a civil matter involving breach of contract and possible theft." The use of their real names sent a chill through Sarah May. Their false identities had been compromised, probably through information provided by Collins or one of Ezekiel's other agents. "Captain," Ben Henderson said firmly, "I don't know any Sarah May Thompson or Jake Morrison. The people working for me are Tom and Mary Wilson, and they've been straight with me about their situation." Crawford looked uncomfortable with the obvious fiction, but before he could respond, the thin bounty hunter stepped forward aggressively. "Don't try to play games with us, old man. We know they're here, and we know you're harboring them." Jake finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Marshal Crawford, you cleared us of any connection to that bank robbery. Now you're here with bounty hunters trying to arrest us on a civil matter. What changed?" "Money changed," Crawford admitted reluctantly. "Mr. Hartwell has a lot of influence in Austin, and judges don't like to be seen as unsympathetic to property rights." "Property rights?" Sarah May stepped forward, her anger finally overcoming her caution. "Marshal, I am not property. I'm a human being with the right to choose my own future, and no contract signed without my consent can change that." The confrontation was interrupted by a new voice from the darkness beyond the camp. "That's far enough, gentlemen." A fourth man emerged from the shadows, James Blackwood, the smooth-talking businessman they had encountered in Fort Worth. But now he carried himself differently, with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Mr. Blackwood," Crawford said with obvious surprise, "what are you doing here?" Blackwood smiled, but it was a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Marshal, I believe you're looking for these two fugitives. It so happens that I've been tracking them as well, and I have information that might be valuable to your investigation." Sarah May felt the trap closing around them as she realized that Blackwood had never been trying to help them reach California. He had been working for Ezekiel all along, using his false offers of assistance to track their movements and gather information about their plans. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond their control, with armed men representing multiple interests, all focused on their capture. In the space of a few hours, they had gone from finding safety with the Henderson family to facing the very real possibility of being dragged back to Texas to face Ezekiel's revenge. But as Sarah May looked around the wagon camp, she realized that they weren't entirely alone. Captain Reynolds looked troubled by the questionable legality of the arrest warrant. The Henderson family had clearly taken their side despite the personal risk involved. And other families in the train were watching the confrontation with expressions that suggested they didn't approve of armed men threatening members of their community. The frontier might be a dangerous place, but it was also a place where ordinary people had learned to stand together against those who would abuse their power. Whether that solidarity would be enough to protect two fugitives from the reach of wealth and influence remained to be seen. As the standoff continued under the starlit sky, Sarah May realized that this moment would determine not just their immediate fate, but the kind of people they would choose to be in the face of overwhelming odds. They could surrender quietly and accept whatever justice money could buy, or they could continue fighting for the principle that freedom was worth any price. The choice, as always, was theirs to make. The tension in the wagon camp stretched like a taut wire as armed men faced each other across the flickering campfires. Sarah May could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching the confrontation, families with children who had suddenly found themselves in the middle of what could easily become a gunfight. The silence was broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the distant sound of night birds calling across the Texas prairie. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, positioning himself between the would-be arresters and his train members. "Marshal Crawford, I've looked at your paperwork, and I have some concerns about its legitimacy. This warrant was issued by a civil court in Austin for a matter that allegedly occurred in Millfield. That's outside Judge Morton's jurisdiction." Crawford's expression showed his own uncertainty about the legal ground he was standing on. "Captain, I've been ordered to bring these people back for questioning. I don't have the luxury of questioning the validity of court orders." "But I do," Reynolds replied firmly. "And as wagon master of this train, I have responsibility for the safety and welfare of everyone under my protection. I won't allow anyone to be taken from my camp without proper legal authority." Blackwood stepped closer. His earlier facade of helpful businessman completely dropped. "Captain Reynolds, you're interfering with a legitimate law enforcement operation. That could be construed as obstruction of justice. And you're threatening members of my train," Ben Henderson interjected, moving to stand beside Reynolds. "That could be construed as banditry." Sarah May watched this confrontation unfold with a mixture of gratitude and terror. These people, Reynolds, the Hendersons and others in the train, were risking their own safety to protect two strangers they barely knew. It was both humbling and inspiring to witness such principled courage. The thin bounty hunter, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to violence. "This is taking too long. We have our orders, and we're going to carry them out. Anyone who interferes will be dealt with accordingly." Jake's hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Rachel Henderson stepped directly between the bounty hunter and Sarah May. "Young man, if you want to take these people, you'll have to go through me first." "And me," said a voice from the crowd. Thomas Miller, one of the other wagon train members, emerged from the gathering circle of onlookers with his rifle cradled in his arms. "And me," added another voice, as Elizabeth Walsh, a widow traveling with her 3 children, moved to stand with the others. One by one, members of the wagon train stepped forward, forming a protective circle around Sarah May and Jake. Men with rifles, women with shotguns, even teenage children with hunting knives, all of them united in their refusal to allow their community to be intimidated by outside forces. Marshal Crawford looked around at the determined faces surrounding him and seemed to realize that his mission had become impossible. "This is madness," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You people are risking federal charges by interfering with law enforcement." "What law enforcement?" Captain Reynolds demanded. "You show up in the middle of the night with bounty hunters and a questionable warrant, demanding to arrest people who haven't been charged with any crime." "Marshal, I've seen real law enforcement, and this isn't it." Sarah May felt tears stinging her eyes as she watched these strangers willing to face down armed men to protect her and Jake. In all her years in Millfield, surrounded by people who had known her since birth, she had never experienced such immediate and unconditional support. "Jake," she whispered, "we can't let them risk their lives for us. There has to be another way." Before Jake could respond, Blackwood played what he clearly thought was his winning card. "Captain Reynolds, perhaps you'd be interested to know that there's a $500 reward for the return of these fugitives. That's more money than most of your train members will see in a year." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah May felt her heart sink as she wondered if the promise of such wealth might fracture the solidarity that had formed around them. $500 was indeed a fortune to frontier families struggling to build new lives in California. But instead of the division Blackwood had hoped to create, his offer seemed to strengthen the resolve of the wagon train members. Thomas, Miller spat into the dirt at Blackwood's feet. "Mister, there isn't enough money in Texas to make me turn on my neighbors." "Besides," added Elizabeth Walsh with a slight smile, "anyone who needs to buy loyalty probably can't afford to keep it." Blackwood's face darkened with frustrated anger. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with. Ezekiel Hartwell has connections throughout Texas and beyond. He can make life very difficult for anyone who crosses him." "And we have connections too," Captain Reynolds replied calmly. "The difference is that ours are based on mutual respect rather than fear and money." Sarah May realized that this confrontation represented something larger than just her personal situation. It was a clash between two different visions of how society should work, one based on wealth and influence, the other on community and shared principles. The standoff was broken by an unexpected intervention. From the darkness beyond the camp came the sound of approaching horses, and moments later a new group of riders emerged into the firelight. At their head rode a man Sarah May didn't recognize, but whose bearing and dress suggested authority of a different kind than what Crawford represented. "What's all this commotion?" the newcomer asked, surveying the scene with sharp eyes. "I'm Federal Marshal William Hayes, and I received reports of some kind of disturbance at this wagon camp." Crawford's face went pale. "Marshal Hayes, I wasn't expecting federal involvement in this matter." "I'll bet you weren't," Hayes replied dryly. "Deputy Crawford, I've been following your recent activities with some interest. Would you care to explain why you're operating outside your jurisdiction with what appears to be a questionable warrant?" The arrival of legitimate federal authority changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Hayes examined Crawford's warrant with the kind of professional scrutiny that immediately revealed its weaknesses. "This document has several problems," Hayes announced after a thorough review. "First, as Captain Reynolds noted, it was issued outside the proper jurisdiction. Second, it fails to specify the actual crimes allegedly committed. Third, it authorizes arrest for questioning in a civil matter, which is not legally permissible under territorial law." Blackwood stepped forward, trying to maintain his earlier confidence. "Marshal Hayes, surely the federal government recognizes the importance of enforcing legitimate contracts and protecting property rights." "The federal government recognizes the Constitution," Hayes replied sharply, "which guarantees certain rights to all citizens, including the right to be free from unlawful arrest and detention." He turned to Sarah May and Jake, his expression serious but not unkind. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Morrison, I understand you've been having some legal difficulties with a gentleman named Ezekiel Hartwell. Would you care to explain your side of the situation?" Sarah May felt a flutter of hope as she realized that she was finally speaking to someone who seemed interested in the truth rather than money or political influence. She told her story simply and honestly: the arranged marriage, her refusal, the agreement she had signed with Ezekiel, and their journey toward California. "Do you have a copy of this agreement you mentioned?" Hayes asked when she finished. Jake produced the document from his saddlebags, and Hayes studied it carefully by firelight. "This appears to be a legitimate contract," he said finally. "Miss Thompson, according to this document, you have 1 year to repay Mr. Hartwell's investment in your marriage arrangements. Until that time expires, you're free to travel wherever you choose." Crawford looked confused. "But Marshal, the warrant specifically mentions theft." "The warrant mentions a lot of things that aren't supported by the actual facts," Hayes interrupted. "Deputy Crawford, you've been manipulated into pursuing a personal vendetta under the guise of law enforcement. I suggest you return to your proper jurisdiction before you find yourself facing disciplinary action." Blackwood made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Marshal Hayes, you're interfering with a private matter between parties who have reached a legal agreement. Mr. Hartwell has every right to protect his interests." Mr. Hartwell has the right to pursue civil remedies through proper legal channels. Hayes corrected. He does not have the right to use intimidation, false arrest, or vigilante justice to resolve his personal disputes. The federal marshal's intervention effectively ended the confrontation. Crawford and his companions withdrew with obvious reluctance, while Blackwood disappeared into the darkness with the kind of haste that suggested he preferred not to face further questions about his role in the affair. As the immediate threat receded, Sarah May found herself surrounded by the wagon train members who had risked their safety to protect her. The gratitude she felt was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with a troubling awareness of the burden her presence placed on these good people. "Captain Reynolds," she said quietly, "Jake and I appreciate everything you and your people have done for us tonight, but we can't continue to put you all at risk. Perhaps it would be better if we found another way to reach California." Reynolds shook his head firmly. "Miss Thompson, what happened here tonight wasn't about you and Mr. Morrison specifically. It was about the principle that decent people don't abandon each other when facing injustice." Ben Henderson nodded agreement. "Sarah May, and I think we can dispense with the false names now. You and Jake are part of this train's family. We don't turn our backs on family regardless of the risks." Rachel Henderson placed a gentle hand on Sarah May's shoulder. "Child, 23 years ago, strangers helped me escape a forced marriage. They didn't do it because they knew me, but because they recognized that what was happening to me was wrong. Tonight, we had the chance to pass that kindness forward." Marshal Hayes, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious approval, turned to address the entire group. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've demonstrated here tonight is the best of American frontier spirit. You've shown that justice isn't just about courts and laws, but about ordinary people willing to stand up for what's right." He turned specifically to Sarah May and Jake. "However, I need to warn you that your troubles aren't over. Ezekiel Hartwell clearly has resources and determination, and he won't give up easily. The agreement you signed gives you legal protection, but only if you can fulfill its terms." "We understand the challenge," Jake replied. $4,500 in 1 year is more money than most people see in a lifetime." "Perhaps," Hayes said thoughtfully, "but California is a land of opportunity for those willing to work hard and think creatively. Gold isn't the only wealth to be found there." As the excitement of the evening finally began to subside, Sarah May found herself reflecting on what had transpired. In the space of a few hours, she had experienced both the worst and best of human nature, the corruption of justice by wealth and influence, and the courage of ordinary people willing to risk everything for strangers. The wagon train settled back into its evening routine, but Sarah May knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. The bonds forged in tonight's crisis had created something more than just a traveling group. They had become a true community, united by shared values and mutual trust. "Jake," she said, as they prepared for sleep beside the Hendersons' wagon, "do you think we'll really be able to repay that debt to Ezekiel?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear Texas sky. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that we'll give everything we have to the attempt. And if we fail, at least we'll fail knowing that we fought for something worthwhile." "And these people," Sarah May said, gesturing toward the sleeping wagon train, "they've shown us what real community looks like. Even if we never see them again after we reach California, they've taught us something valuable about the kind of life we want to build together." As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah May's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for the strangers who had become family and a determination to prove worthy of the faith they had shown in her. The road to California stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but she no longer felt like she was traveling it alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new tests of their courage and determination. But tonight, Surrounded by people who had chosen principle over profit and justice over convenience, Sarah May felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Texas: genuine hope for the future. The wagon train would roll out at dawn, carrying them all toward whatever destiny awaited in the golden hills of California. For the first time since this adventure began, Sarah May was looking forward rather than back, anticipating what lay ahead rather than fearing what pursued from behind. The transformation was complete. The frightened young woman who had fled and wanted marriage had become someone capable of inspiring others to risk their safety for the sake of justice. Whatever challenges California might bring, she would face them as an equal partner with Jake, supported by the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together. 2 years later, Sacramento, California. Sarah May Morrison stood on the porch of their modest but thriving ranch house, watching the sunset over the Sacramento Valley, while her 6-month-old daughter, Hope, slept peacefully in her arms. The golden light painted the rolling hills in shades of amber and bronze, a daily reminder of why this land had earned its name as the Golden State. Jake emerged from the barn, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man whose hard work was finally bearing fruit. Their partnership with Thomas Whitmore had exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. What had begun as simple ranch employment had evolved into a revolutionary cooperative arrangement that was drawing attention from agricultural investors throughout California. "The final payment is ready," Jake announced, holding up a leather satchel that contained $4,500 in gold and silver coins. "Tomorrow morning, we'll send it to Ezekiel Hartwell with a letter confirming that all terms of our agreement have been fulfilled." Sarah May felt a complex mixture of emotions at this moment she had dreamed of for 2 years. Relief, certainly, that the sword of Damocles that had hung over their heads was finally being removed. Pride in what they had accomplished together, but also a kind of sadness that this chapter of their lives was ending. "Do you think he expected us to succeed?" she asked, shifting little Hope to her other arm. Jake joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of a marriage built on genuine partnership. "I think he was certain we would fail. Men like Ezekiel can't imagine that people without wealth or influence could accomplish anything significant. Their success had come through a combination of innovation, hard work, and the kind of community support they had first experienced on the wagon train." Sarah May's idea to establish a school for ranch children had evolved into a profitable enterprise that served families throughout the valley. Her teaching provided steady income, while Jake's work with the horses contributed to Whitmore's expanding breeding program. But their real breakthrough had come when Sarah May proposed organizing the scattered ranchers into a cooperative marketing association. By pooling their resources and coordinating their sales, small ranchers could compete with larger operations and command better prices for their livestock and crops. The idea had been revolutionary, challenging the established patterns of individual competition that had dominated frontier agriculture. But Sarah May's careful planning and Jake's practical knowledge had made it work, creating prosperity for dozens of families while earning them a percentage of the increased profits. "The Hendersons sent another letter," Jake said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "They've reached Oregon territory safely and started their wheat farm. Rachel says to tell you that the courage you showed on the wagon train inspired 3 other women in their settlement to leave unhappy marriages." Sarah May smiled, remembering the woman who had become like a second mother to her during their westward journey. The bonds formed during that difficult passage had remained strong despite the distances that now separated them. And Captain Reynolds, still leading wagon trains, but he started requiring all train members to sign agreements about mutual aid and community support. He calls them Sarah May clauses, in honor of what happened that night in the camp. The recognition of her influence on others still surprised Sarah May. The frightened young woman who had fled Texas had somehow become someone whose example inspired others to find their own courage. A rider approached their ranch, and Sarah May recognized the familiar figure of Federal Marshal Hayes, who had become a friend over the past 2 years. His visits were social now rather than official, but his presence still reminded her of how close they had come to losing everything. "Marshal Hayes," Jake called in greeting. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing our final payment to Ezekiel. Artwell." Hayes dismounted and joined them on the porch, accepting Sarah May's offer of coffee with obvious pleasure. "That's actually why I'm here. I received word through official channels that Ezekiel Hartwell died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. Apparently, his estate is being settled by his nephew, who seems far more interested in selling assets than pursuing old grudges." The news hit Sarah May like a physical blow. For 2 years, Ezekiel had represented the threat that could destroy everything they had built. His death should have been liberating, but instead, she felt an unexpected sadness for a man whose inability to understand partnership had ultimately left him alone and bitter. "What does this mean for our agreement?" Jake asked practically. "Legally, you're still obligated to fulfill the terms," Hayes replied. "But the nephew has indicated he's willing to accept a reduced settlement if you're interested in negotiating." Sarah May looked at the satchel containing their carefully saved money, then at her husband and daughter, and finally at the prosperous ranch that represented everything they had built together. "No," she said firmly. "We'll pay the full amount as agreed. Our word means something, even if his nephew is willing to settle for less." Jake nodded approvingly. "Besides, we can afford it now. The cooperative earned enough profit this year to cover the payment and still leave us with substantial savings." Hayes smiled. "I thought you might say that. It's one of the things I've always admired about you both. Your integrity hasn't been compromised by your success." As evening settled over the valley, Sarah May reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The terrified young woman who had stood in her mother's wedding dress, contemplating marriage to a man she didn't love, seemed like a different person entirely. That woman had been defined by her limitations, by what she couldn't do, couldn't choose, couldn't become. The person she was now had learned that limitations existed mainly in the mind, that courage was something that grew stronger with use, and that partnership meant finding someone who made you more than you could be alone. "Jake," she said as they watched the last light fade from the sky, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had married Ezekiel? If we had never taken that risk?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think you would have survived it," he said finally. "You're stronger than you knew back then, but I don't think you would have been happy, and I don't think the world would have benefited from all the things you've accomplished here." It was true. The school she had founded now served 43 children. The cooperative she had organized had increased the average income of member families by 30%. Her influence on other women's choices had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their valley. "And us?" she asked. "Do you think we would have found each other eventually, even if circumstances had been different?" "I'd like to think so," Jake replied, pulling her closer. "But I'm grateful we don't have to find out. Sometimes the best thing about taking a risk is that it makes you appreciate what you gain even more." The next morning they sent the payment to Texas with a letter that was both businesslike and gracious. Sarah May had drafted it carefully, acknowledging their obligation while making it clear that their success had vindicated the choice they had made. As the stagecoach disappeared down the dusty road carrying their final payment to Ezekiel's estate, Sarah May felt the last chain from her old life fall away. She was completely free now, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. What now? Jake asked, watching the dust settle behind the departing coach. Sarah May looked around at the life they had built together. The thriving ranch, the growing community, the possibilities that stretched endlessly before them. Their daughter would grow up in a world where women could own businesses, make important decisions, and choose their own destinies. The cooperative they had founded was already being studied by agricultural experts from as far away as San Francisco. Now, we keep building, she said simply. We keep proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the courage to try. And as the California sun climbed higher into the endless blue sky, Sarah May Morrison began planning their next adventure, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equal partners in a life they had chosen for themselves. The scared young woman who had once believed her only choices were marriage or ruin had discovered something far more valuable than security, the knowledge that freedom was not something to be given or taken away, but something to be claimed and defended by those brave enough to reach for it. Her story had become a testament to the power of courage, the importance of community, and the truth that love built on partnership was stronger than any arrangement built on obligation. It was a lesson she would spend the rest of her life teaching others, one brave choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.